Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you tonight to this free running injury and shoe presentation, and later on a Q&A session. Firstly, I'd like to thank and welcome all in one hit our panelists tonight. Shaun Bergin, he's from Fairfield Podiatry. We've got Chris Wight from the Running Company in Clifton Hill, and Barton from Complete Sports Care in Hawthorn. So formally welcome those guys, and I'm very excited to have them on board. They're all very, very knowledgeable in their areas of expertise, and we're lucky to have them tonight for this session, which is free and open to anyone that wanted to log into it. So one of the benefits of the lockdown is that, and COVID, is that we've been introduced to a lot of different webinars, and I've got great pleasure in being part of this one. So I'd like to get it started and hand it over to our first speaker. And Shaun, I believe is that you or Christian?
Christian's up first.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, Christian, as we all know, I just introduced, he's a physiotherapist at Complete Sports Care, and I'll hand it over to you, Christian.
Thanks, JB. As we go through tonight, I think what's important is we're obviously going to present information. You're not able to talk, but you do have the little Q&A box at the bottom. So feel free to pop questions in there. If you just want banter and chit chat, definitely chuck that in the chat box, and we might share some different links as we go on as well. But if you've got additional questions beyond what's already been asked, please feel free to pop them up. I'm just going to share my screen to start off with one of the first questions that we had, which relates to static stretching. My screen's being very slow at sharing, so I'm going to start talking probably before the actual slide comes up for everyone. So one of the questions we have is, do we need to stretch? And I think the first thing we need to ask for is why do we stretch, or why do we think we need to stretch? I was taught as a kid, actually from a very young age, that I should be stretching before and after sport to help me reduce injury risk and help with recovery primarily. And we were told that we probably need to stretch for at least 30 seconds. And I was told this when I went to physio school and learned how to be a physio. And the idea was that would help with flexibility, and it certainly does in the short term. But if you actually look at the research evidence around stretching and whether it does reduce injury risk, and so these are from big, what we call randomized controlled trials, where we have half the group receive advice and guidance on stretching and the other half the group told not to stretch at all, which is actually quite challenging for a running population. What it tells us is that the group who does stretching very regularly before or after running doesn't seem to reduce their risk of running injuries. So they don't get less running injuries by stretching compared to not stretching, which is kind of interesting. And then if we look at the DOMS perspective, so these delayed onset muscle soreness, and we think about recovery, it doesn't seem to also help with that side of things as well. So again, being told to stretch versus being told not to stretch. So that doesn't necessarily mean that stretching is harmful. So I think that's really important. So if it's something you enjoy and some people find it almost meditative, then you might want to continue stretching. I think that's important. But it's not something you have to do or are forced to do, unless there's a therapeutic reason that you might be told to do it for a particular muscle group or a particular area by a health professional you might see. But broadly, stretching is probably not going to make a big difference to running injury or recovery. What we do know from some of the research is that actually, instead of doing static stretching for your warm-up, what you're best to do is what we call an active warm-up. So these are things like dynamic stretches. So things like a walking lunge, maybe some old-fashioned windmill type exercises, things that are really going to get your muscles moving, leg swings, those types of activities that start to load the muscles a little bit and get them ready for competition and running. And then what you would gradually do is build up your running. So you might start off with some slow run throughs, and then you might do 3 or 4 run throughs, sort of at your race pace or what you're aiming to run at full velocity, but just do that for 80 or 100 meters or so. And that's probably the best way to look at warm up. And we know from other sports, so not necessarily a running population, but if we look at things like football and netball and basketball, doing these types of warm up exercises not only reduce risk of traumatic injuries like knee injuries that occur in these sports, but they also do reduce the risk of soft tissue injuries, so hamstrings and calves and those types of things. So if you've got a spare 10 minutes before you go for a run, I would suggest that you spend your time doing some of these things, so some of the more dynamic stretching. So that's probably a key sort of thing. And you'll notice that these are infographics. So these are actually freely available on our Latrobe blog. So I'll get JB or Shaun to send these around to everyone. So we've got some related to stretching, related to barefoot running, which we'll talk about next, related to strength training, a whole range of things. So you can have a read through some of it a little bit later. And this tries to distill a lot of information from a lot of research trials. And then the next question that I'm going to take and field that's been given is, what about barefoot running? So there's this big push for barefoot running. So the first thing I'll put up is just the still frame of a runner. So you'll see on the left side, it should pop up in a second if it hasn't already, is a runner running in a pair of shoes. And Chris and Shaun will talk more about shoes later. You could argue that this girl might need some new shoes to help with her shin pain that she's managing. But the reason I've got this video up is this was actually from a running course. I teach these to physios all around the world. And one of the people in the group just had this obsession with barefoot running. He said, oh, why don't you just take the shoes off this girl and that'll sort out her shin pain and change her running biomechanics. And so you'll see on the left-hand side, she's got this, what we call a heavy heel strike, landing out quite a way in front of her body. She's putting a lot of load through the front of her shin. But if you go to the right-hand side and we've taken her shoes off, her running pattern actually hasn't changed. So the reason I put this up is shoes are not a panacea for things. They're not going to change the way we run, even if we make dramatic changes like taking our shoes off. They can certainly help facilitate that, and we'll discuss that and talk through it. But changing your shoes doesn't guarantee it's going to change the way you run. So they're more of a tool that can help us achieve some of those things. So when I send people to see Shaun or see Chris, what I'll often be sending them to do is have a look at strategies we might be able to use with shoes or orthotics or other things to help make some mechanical changes. I'm a big believer that it's really about form before footwear. If you go to the other end of the spectrum, most of you will know people like or someone like Cliff Young, who ran for many, many years in gumboots around his farm for 2 or 3 hours a day, and he never really developed any injuries. So the reason I point that out as a case example is it probably, again, shows that over obsession with shoes somewhere. It doesn't mean they don't matter, and there's certainly, you can get shoes wrong, but you can adapt to running in different types of footwear as well. So if we go to, again, probably just another myth that comes up from some of the questions, and that is switching to a forefoot strike or running barefoot or minimal shoes might reduce your injury risk. The reason this come about was that there was a book called Born to Run, and I'm sure some of you have read the book. Some of you may not have. It's a very well-written book. It's a very emotive story about a guy who goes out into the bush, essentially, and he learns from people who are traditional barefoot runners. And he really enjoyed it and had a great story himself. And this led to a lot of people taking it up. And there were some studies published in high quality journals, poor quality studies, but published in high quality journals that promoted barefoot running as being potential panacea for injuries. And the reason was that it seemed that people who were barefoot runners had less injuries. And this was from some anecdotal stories and cross-sectional work. And then they did some biomechanical research, and it showed a reduction in a variable of biomechanics we call impact forces. So how much forces are going through our limb when people who ran barefoot were compared to people who didn't run bare feet. But that didn't take into account that people running barefoot probably also were more habituated to running, so they're probably better runners and more conditioned to do it, which is probably part of the reason. And then the other thing is we take shoes off, that doesn't always change our impact forces as well. So when you then turn to research and you do high quality studies and look at RCTs and say, okay, what happens if we take shoes off a group of people? What it typically does is it changes where the loads go. So most people, it will change their strike pattern. So they'll go from landing on their heel to landing on the ball of their foot more. But what that means is you've got less load on the knee and the hip, which might help those injuries, but you've actually got more load on the foot and ankle. And so clinically, we'll often see people come in with stress fractures of their metatarsals. And I'm sure some of you have histories of those and have had those dreaded cam boots as a result of those injuries. We see calf injuries, Achilles injuries, a whole range of things. And what we're doing is taking shoes away or just attempting to change strike pattern. We don't magically make loads disappear. They still have to be absorbed somewhere in the body. And what we're doing is just shifting them to a different area. So based on quality research and thinking about these things, what we need to understand is if we're thinking about performance or managing injuries or managing injury risk, just taking shoes off is maybe not the best go, and even changing strike pattern is not always the best go. We need to think about other interventions and more sensible things like managing our training loads, making sure we recover well. So thinking about sleep, thinking about our diet and all those types of things is far, far more important than thinking about barefoot running in the first instance. The other thing we can think about is exercise, and that's my bias. You'll see I'm sitting at my gym at Complete Sports Care. I'm missing it a lot, not able to use it all that much at the moment. But doing resistance training can also help with managing injuries. And if we talk about performance, adding resistance training doesn't have to be a gym, can be good quality resistance training at home. That's a much safer way to try and improve your running performance than taking your shoes. The only thing that taking your shoes away probably does is makes you lighter on your feet. And we know that that is going to help performance. So if you can get yourself to wearing lighter shoes or adapted to be able to run with more minimal shoes, that will certainly help performance. But to do it, you need to make the transition really, really gradually. And that can take 6 months, 12 months, sometimes longer than that as we go forward. So that's a few little points around that. So if there's further questions related to barefoot running and stretching and things, definitely happy to talk more about it. I'm sure the other guys will as well. But I think I'm going to pass it over to Chris now to go a bit more in detail into shoes themselves.
Thanks, Christian. If Shaun can bring up my first question. So for those of you who don't know, I've got actually a background in engineering. I looked for a change and ended up selling running shoes. I've had the running company in Clifton Hill for 6 years now. And kind of day to day for us is, looking at people and helping them get into shoes that they're going to enjoy and that makes sense for how they move as well. So first question that we have tonight was, should you wear different shoes for different running sessions? So the answer, there's no straight answer, yes or no for this, but something to consider with running shoes is that different running shoes are designed for different purposes, and what you want for one type of running could be very different to another. If you're going to go out and just run around at a pretty easy pace, or maybe run for quite a long time, then typically what you want is just something that's going to be really comfortable to do that. And things that will typically lend themselves to being comfortable are things that are, for most people, a little bit softer, typically a little bit more flexible as well. I've grabbed a few shoes here. A pretty kind of simple shoe here is something like this. There's a decent amount of cushioning. It's quite soft. The fit through the upper is relatively relaxed through the front, so that when your foot lands, it has room to spread and move within the shoe. It's nice and flexible through the front here. It's a little bit stiffer at the back, and that provides a little bit of protection. And it's quite easy just to maintain a stable position on top of this shoe. The problem with, not a problem, but something that you will encounter when trying to run a little bit faster in this shoe is that comfort comes at the expense of weight. And when you've got something relatively soft underneath your foot, as you land and go to push off, you're going to do that a lot quicker when you're running faster. So you're going to be still sinking into this shoe when you're trying to push off it. So typically, if we move to something to run faster, and typically want is a little bit lighter. We want a firmer cushioning to it and something that's a little bit stiffer. So, as the shoe moves, this is quite soft and flexible. If we go into something that's like just a pretty simple lightweight shoe, it's a lot stiffer. For the same amount of force, it doesn't bend nearly as much. The foam that they use for the cushioning is a lot firmer. And so as you go to land and push off again, you're not going to sink into the shoe as much, and it's going to probably bounce back with a little bit more force than what a more cushioned, more shoe that's more appropriate for running longer is going to do. So, that's just kind of two ones. Like as you go even kind of shorter again, maybe you're going onto an athletics track or a softer surface. Again, you've got a bit of a cushioning to the surface that you're running on there as well. So probably going even firmer again. And, something like this is something that I just use when I'm doing kind of shorter intervals on the track. A lot less cushioning through the front here. It's got a little bit of flex to it, but it's relatively stiff for how thin it is. Very light. And the fit is a lot more tapered through the front. So it's a lot more of a performance fit as well. Not going to feel very good to run in a shoe like this for a long period of time, but it's going to be very responsive and very fun to run short and fast in as well. So I might get Shaun to bring up the next question now as well, if he could for me. So So the best method for rotating shoes. I would always go for differing shoes. As I just mentioned, what you want out of one shoe for another. If you're going to look to rotate shoes for just that kind of easy running shoe, and whether you're going to have two or one shoe, there's some really good benefits just from having some differences in the shoes that you're running. The enemy with running related injuries is repetition. So any subtle changes to footwear that you can have, which will break up some of that repetition that we're all exposed to during running, it's going to be a lot better to have subtle differences between any shoes that you do use. So, I mean, for myself, I have a lot more shoes than most people, just purely because it's my job. So, but even if it wasn't my job, I'd still have quite a few different shoes. It allows shoes to recover a little bit in between runs as well. Typically would suggest that, to get the full recovery of the foam, which is, I guess, your shock absorption within a shoe, is going to take about 48 hours to get full recovery out of that. So having a couple of pairs of shoes for different purposes does allow a little bit more time for the shoes to recover. And it's not going to really cost you more money either. You're still going to get X amount of Ks per each shoe. So as long as you're getting that full amount of use out of each shoe and wearing all your shoes out, it's just going to change, I guess, when you spend the money as opposed to how much money you spend. So we see a lot of benefit for having multiple shoes. So carbon fiber shoes, all the rage at the moment. So will they make you run faster, and should you use them in training or just for races? The best thing that's going to make you run fast is staying injury-free and consistent training. One of the things we like to, or how we kind of describe the shoes, is that they will allow you to capitalize on good training. So there's pretty solid evidence to suggest that they will help you run faster, but overwhelming, the gains from the shoe are going to be pretty small relative to good training, and probably also nutrition as well. I mean, one of the things that I think gets overlooked a lot in the big discussions that they have, which have been in a lot of different publications about the benefits of these carbon fiber shoes, and the reduction in marathon time. They never make any comment about nutrition within this as well. And I mean, I would always say that for me, and in a marathon, a shoe like, say, this one here, which is a Vaporfly, a very, very kind of responsive, bouncy foam, a carbon plate running through the shoe as well. The carbon plate has a little bit of a curvature to it. So as you effectively kind of push weight onto the front and spring this way, bring your weight forward, it just springs forward. So it does load a little bit like a spring. But this is probably worth a couple of minutes to me in a marathon, and probably a little bit less the better trained I am. I would say taking gels and nutrition is probably worth about 10 to 15 minutes for me. And if you look back to, the times that, whether it's Mona or Deke were doing, those guys were not eating anything during a marathon at all. They'd carb load the night before. And one of the big shifts over the last few years has been with these elite runners taking on a lot more carbohydrate during their marathons. And I would say that that would be a much more significant performance contributor than what that would be. So if you are going to use the shoes, and I mean, something to also consider about them is that they are a lot of fun to run in. And I imagine a lot of you, like myself, like running means a lot to you. That's an investment I would make just purely just because I love the feel of it, and it helps me enjoy my running more, which is really important to me. I do like to train in them a little bit as well. Like there's an old saying, don't do anything on race day that you haven't done in training. So it makes sense to use them a little bit. And whether you specifically, use something like you're going to use on race day, or potentially use something a little bit similar, but maybe a little bit heavier, a little bit more durable. One of the downsides of these are that they're very light. Sorry, that's an upside, but the downside of that is that weight is tied to durability. So anything that is, the lighter you get, the less material there is to deal with the force. So things are going to break down quicker, and you pay quite a lot for the manufacture of these, and you don't get nearly the durability of a normal shoe. So, you know, not a lot of outsole coverage here, quite thin and narrow through there. So it's a little bit unstable under the foot. If you kind of get into, say, a shoe like this, has carbon fiber plate in there, a little bit more forgiving than what the race ones are, but a little bit wider through here, a little bit more stable, a lot more rubber outsole coverage as well. And it just makes it a little bit more durable while still giving you some sort of similarity to some of these carbon plated shoes as well. So. Supportive, neutral, cushion shoes best. What's best is in whether it's neutral or supportive or whatever type or model of shoe it is, it's purely up to the individual. You really need to kind of, I guess, consider, you know, I mean, all aspects of running, but definitely shoes is a little bit of an experiment of one. And it's about working out what works for yourself. So it's very kind of murky, I guess, trying to make kind of broad generalizations about support or neutral for a lot of people. One of the things as well is that we talk about supportive shoes, and all the different companies, when they say supportive shoe, it could be totally different mechanisms that are at work in the shoe from one company to another. So, you know, you take a supportive shoe from ASICS and a supportive shoe from Brooks, they're designed to do totally different things and try and control your body in a different way. So the pretty simple approach that we take to it is we look at, there's going to be some force going through your foot, and we just want to make sure that the shoe has the integrity in the areas where you're applying more force to. So we also want to make sure that the shoe isn't going to interfere too much with how your body wants to move. One of the main, I guess, controls or limiters of a supportive shoe is controlling pronation. And that feature, you know, that function of the body is a shock absorbing function. So you've got to be a little bit careful about controlling with that, but there's definitely going to be some people that are going to get a benefit from a shoe that has had a little bit more structure to it, a little bit more protection, and reduce a little bit of risk as well. So how often should you buy new shoes? For a typical kind of training shoe, what the brands typically aim for in terms of durability is about 800 kilometers. A lighter shoe, less material, it's not going to last quite as long. And in terms of that life of a shoe, the brands try to give you, I guess, pretty consistent functionality out of the shoe for about 800 kilometers, at which point the amount of force that's been accumulated by the shoe starts to, I guess, interfere or impact the integrity of the shoe. For some people, this will mean taking on a little bit more force or stress through certain tissue. And that can be problematic for some people. For other people, no issue at all. It's not necessarily about how much stress your body is exhibited to. It can be about how much it can take, and not exceeding your tolerance to stress. For myself, I can find that I can run in a shoe like quite a bit after 800 Ks, but the other thing there for me is, again, coming back to how much running means to me, enjoying my running, is that I just enjoy my running more when I have shoes that feel like they have a little bit of life and bounce to them. So I kind of change mine over a little bit less than 800 Ks, just because I find that that's what ultimately makes me kind of, or keeps me enjoying my running a little bit more. So I find that quite important too. Pros and cons of elastic laces. So I guess the one scenario where elastic lace makes sense for myself would be a quick transition in a triathlon. one thing with the upper of a shoe, like typically being, you know, this part of the shoe through here, there is some structure through that upper which is designed to actually hold and support the foot. If you've got something that's overly, a lot of give and movement through that area of it, it is going to, I guess, compromise the integrity of that structure through the upper. It's not necessarily going to cause you problems, but for some people there might be a little bit more risk through there. Other cons, I actually quite enjoy lacing my, like, I find it, you know, quite a ritual for me, like putting the shoes on in the morning and just like being quite deliberate about lacing them up. I enjoy that little bit before I go out for a run. So for me, elastic laces would take that away from me, and that's probably a con for me as well. But outside of, you know, the quick transition for triathlon, I don't see too many other pros for them. I think that now will pass me across to Shaun.
All right, thanks, Chris. That was great. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us on your Wednesday evening. Hope you're enjoying this so far. First couple of questions I am going to cover are from Marissa and from Chris, and they relate to orthotics. So before I actually answer their questions, I thought I'd quickly cover a little bit about what orthotics are and what they aren't, as there are quite a lot of misconceptions out there in the general public, and us health professionals are usually to blame for what people think about orthotics. But orthotics are basically often called insoles or arch supports. It's a device that goes inside a shoe and is designed to fit and contour to the feet. And most people, what they know or think about orthotics is usually related to quite old school and outdated information and theory. So if you look at the picture here, which is looking at the back of someone's heel, and it's got a line bisecting the heel and the lower leg. Basically, what whoever has done this is looking at is the alignment of the rear foot in relation to the lower leg. And an old school podiatrist or health professional would probably be concerned about the alignment of the heel or rear foot in relation to the lower leg, as the heel is slightly everted or tilting inwards a little bit. And one reason that people have been given orthotics over the years is to try and correct this foot structure or foot posture. And basically, you'll often see on the internet and on social media the image on the left followed by the image on the right, which is when someone then stands on top of an orthotic or have an orthotic in their shoe, the rear foot is vertical in relation to the lower leg. There are a huge number of issues with these types of images and these theories. First and foremost, I think that this has actually just been made up. There's actually not great research out there that tells us what normal actually is. It does seem to be different from one person to another. So to even consider the image on the left abnormal and something that needs to be corrected just based on the appearance of it is probably just straight out incorrect. Also, it gives us an idea that orthotics work by realigning the feet, which we also don't have any evidence to really support. Orthotics sometimes can change the visual appearance of someone's foot structure when they're standing on them or when they're moving. But it does seem that the research is pointing us more towards orthotics working. One of the ways that they might work is by changing the stress going through the tissues or the forces going through the tissues. And these are things that we actually can't see. So it's actually a lot easier to go with this old school approach because people usually will learn visually and they can see that there's been a change from the left image to the right image. And for a lot of people, that helps them to make sense of what's going on. But I think the key thing to understand is we probably don't know enough about what normal foot structure and function actually is to be able to then say something is normal or abnormal and then try and move someone closer towards normal. We should be really trying to gain a bit more of an understanding of what's going on underneath the surface, and it is more challenging and also harder to explain to people. But evidence-based or evidence-informed health professionals need to make more effort to work on explaining this to people and guiding people as to what's actually going on. So effectively, I think orthotics, generally for most people, one of the main ways that they work is they modify the stress going through the tissues. So what I've got over on the right-hand side of my screen is an image where first image, tissue stress is in red and tissue capacity is in blue. And this is quite a simplistic way of explaining injury, but I think it will make sense to you guys, and I do think it is relevant. So effectively, if the tissue stress is less, so basically what we're doing, the stress we're applying to the tissues, so that might be the Achilles tendon, for example, if it's less than that tissue's capacity to tolerate that stress, then in most cases you should stay injury or pain-free. There are other factors that could influence this, but for the most part you will stay pain or injury-free. It's usually when this tissue stress increases above the tissue's capacity to tolerate that stress that we're either at risk of injury or an injury or pain will actually develop. And I think that orthotics are usually going to be working to help to reduce the tissue stress. So if someone develops an injury and we feel like the person's foot structure, foot function, the way that they're moving might be or might have contributed to a significant increase in tissue stress, then potentially we could use orthotics to take some of the stress away from the tissues that have become sensitive and painful or injured, and put that stress somewhere else where it will be better tolerated, so that that area has a better chance of calming down, you'll be more comfortable and potentially be able to return to activity faster. That's the main way that I look at using orthotics, and I think that is an evidence-informed approach. I think the main thing is that most of the time when the tissue stress increases above tissue capacity, particularly when it happens suddenly, it's not usually due to someone's foot structure or function that happens, because most of the time that hasn't changed significantly. And if it does, it doesn't happen overnight, that's for sure. It happens quite gradually in most cases. So most of the time when the tissue stress increases suddenly and significantly, it'll be because someone's changed their training load. So I'm sure everyone will agree, and we might talk about this later, that that's one of the most common causes of running injuries and something that we need to pay particular attention to. But even so, potentially someone might, if they're using orthotics to reduce the tissue stress and calm things down, they might not need to drop back to no running at all, for example. They might be able to just reduce their training load to a more manageable level, and that might be slightly higher than if they didn't have orthotics in place. So that's one way to think about how orthotics work. In terms of Marissa's question, so can you stop using orthotics? Yeah, absolutely. When you think of orthotics that way, can stop using orthotics. For some people, you know, there really aren't any huge concerns around their foot structure and function, and they've been generally pretty well injury-free and completing events. Often I see people present with their first injury, having run 10, 15 marathons and you know, getting the miles in for quite a long time. So generally for those people, it's rare that there's something going on that's been missed, that's then, you know, foot structure or function related, that has then been one of the main causative factors of their injury. However, we could still potentially use orthotics in the short to medium term to help manage the stress going through the tissues and calm things down, maybe potentially keep them training if there's an event coming up, as long as we've got enough time to make the adaptation to something new, which would be the orthotics, or potentially just to give them some symptom relief. It may not even be when they're actually running. It might be if they're active during the day, for example, say if it's a tradesperson or a nurse, potentially managing the stress going through the tissues when they're at work might mean that they've got less discomfort as their starting point for when they're actually going out and doing their training. So often orthotics can actually be used in the short to medium term. It's not a life sentence when you get orthotics. I think the main thing is that if someone's been using orthotics for quite a long time, I'm often banging my head against a wall as to why they're being given orthotics when they answer that question that I asked them, as a lot of the time I kind of disagree with the prescription of the orthotics or the reasoning that they've been given, and that's not their fault. That's the health professional's fault, and unfortunately that still happens a fair bit these days. But even if I feel that way, if that person's been using orthotics for a really long time, then their feet and their lower limbs will be used to how the orthotics help to manage the tissue stress. So even if I think that they may not actually need orthotics, or if they've never had them, I might not give them to them. If they've been using them for a really long time, then I'd be quite cautious with regards to recommending that they stop using them. If they were comfortable, they fitted in their shoes, and they were happy with how they were fitting and working in their shoes, they hadn't had any injuries, they were completing the amount of training that they wanted to complete, and they were racing and not having any issues with that, then it would probably be more risky to take those orthotics away than to actually leave them in place. And for that person, if I was actually going to take them away, I would recommend that we do that very gradually. And for that type of person, they're probably not going to want to drop their training load down in order to remove the orthotics if there's no real concerns around them and they're actually quite happy with them. So even if I'm not of the belief that they absolutely need them, I would still potentially encourage them to continue using them, because it would be more of a hassle and potentially more of a risk to remove them, particularly if it was done too quickly. If someone was looking to remove those orthotics, like I said, you would do it gradually. And the other thing as well is that you would want to try and establish whether they've got the tissue capacity to tolerate an increase in stress on the tissues. So that might be looking at their strength in certain areas, range of motion in certain areas, making sure that their training load is well managed and being monitored, particularly by someone like John, to make sure that there's not going to be any extra risk there. So you can definitely stop using orthotics. It's probably best to discuss that with a podiatrist when you actually get orthotics, rather than use them for a really long time and then just hope to stop using them. And to be honest, the onus is on the podiatrist to actually have that conversation with people. So it's not a clear-cut answer, but hopefully that gives you some sort of understanding of how I think that should be approached. Chris asked, can shoes replace what orthotics do? I think the difference is that the orthotics are designed to fit and contour to the feet. You have a whole range of different options, from off-the-shelf or prefabricated orthotics to fully customised or bespoke orthotics. However, regardless of whether they're more off-the-shelf or more customised, the orthotics are designed to fit and contour directly to the feet, whereas most of the things in the shoes that are designed to try and have an impact on the way that the feet or the lower limbs are functioning, and also the stress or the forces going through the tissues, are within the actual midsole of the shoe. So just by the fact that they will be applying pressure to different parts of the feet in a different way, they can definitely work quite differently. I think the other thing is as well that you have the potential, even with off-the-shelf orthotics, to customise them to suit the individual's needs. So even if you're going for a generic off-the-shelf orthotic, which would be the same on both sides, if there was something going on one side that wasn't going on the other side, and you felt like you needed to try and change that, you could easily modify the orthotic on the one side. Obviously, it's not practical to wear two different types of shoes. You're not going to wear a shoe that's more supportive and a shoe that's less supportive. I guess you could, but I haven't seen many people doing that. So orthotics do work differently, and I do think they will have a more specific effect on the feet and on reducing tissue stress, and they should. They're prescribed to people based on thorough assessment and an understanding of what's going on and what the person's goals are. And particularly if it's something that's more customised, it would be designed based on a 3D scan of that person's feet. So it should take into consideration the differences from one side to the other. And if they're not doing more than what a shoe can do, assuming that they're needed, that is, then it's probably not worth having the orthotics at all. So I might leave that there for now. Keeping an eye on the time. So Emily just asked for some tips for runners with bunions. So I'll just cruise through this. So really common sense, but I think most people will know that a bunion is a change in the alignment of the big toe joint. Often people think that there's a growth of bone around the big toe. That is possible if someone has osteoarthritis in their big toe joint, but in most cases it's actually a change in the alignment of the joint. So the two bones that form the joint are not aligned as you would expect normally. One of the key things here is just to make sure that your runners fit well. So it's super common sense, but I see so many people still that have bunions that become painful, and the quick fix is to get them in a shoe that fits better. And Chris, I'm sure, can attest to this. That happens super duper frequently. In most cases, people need to go for a wider option. So standard width runners for women is generally B width, and for men it's D width. Most women that have this change in alignment of their big toe joint will need at least a D width shoe, and men will usually jump up to a 2E width, and they can go wider than that if need be. Often we see people go for a longer shoe because it will be wider. The problem is, as you go longer, you start to move the widest part of the shoe further forward, and often the widest part of the shoe doesn't actually match up with the widest part of the foot. So we can still see people with a much bigger shoe that doesn't fit well where it needs to fit well. So that's something that's a common mistake to keep in mind. I think it's also important to make sure that most of your day-to-day shoes fit well. So I've seen plenty of runners over the years that have bunions that are uncomfortable when they're running, but their running shoes are actually okay and their foot function is generally okay. It's just the shoes they get around in most of the time that irritate the hell out of the big toe joint and make it sensitive, which then makes it very easily irritated when they go out for a run. So I know particularly for women that might want to wear nice shoes from time to time, but being mindful of the fit of the shoes that you wear most of the time is actually really important and might help you stay pain-free when you're running. I get asked a lot about splints and toe separators. There's been a fair bit of that stuff floating around on Facebook in recent years. The cheap options that supposedly realign bunions or big toe joints. There's no evidence to support that. Those devices usually don't work at all, and for most people they're actually not comfortable. So most of the time they're designed to be worn overnight, and most people lose sleep from wearing it because it's just not comfortable, which means they ditch it very quickly. Toe separators probably are a little more useful, but they still won't realign the big toe joint. It might change the alignment of the big toe joint when it's in place, but it won't lead to a permanent change there. Sometimes if someone's got symptoms, there might be some symptomatic relief, or if they had some hard skin building up between their big toe and their second toe, it might help reduce the pressure there and improve comfort levels. But I wouldn't be using a splint or a toe separator to realign the big toe joint. I think you'll be disappointed if you do that. If you've got bunions and you start to experience pain when walking and or running, it's important to get help as soon as possible. It can definitely become a persistent and debilitating problem. And not only can it be a problem around the big toe joint, but it can overload other parts of the lower limb and foot. Commonly, it will cause pain through the outside of the forefoot. And often the problems that develop as a result of trying to push through pain in the big toe joint will be much worse and harder to manage than the actual big toe joint pain in the first place. So it's important to get on top of it quickly. The goal is going to be to reduce pain and maintain, and ideally, if you can, improve function rather than improve alignment. The only way to improve the alignment of your big toe joint is to have surgery, which is occasionally required, but for most people, if they wear shoes that fit well and they get on top of symptoms, if they develop reasonably quickly, they don't ever have to go anywhere near having surgery. Megan asked for some tips on blister prevention, so I'll fly through this as well. So one of the questions was, is it better for your skin to be hard or soft? So blisters are caused by shear stress, which is basically stretching of the skin. So if you have calluses, which are areas of thick skin, it doesn't actually reduce the shear stress. And if you want to get an idea of where blisters are more likely to develop, in most cases, they'll develop in areas where the callus is formed. So the callus is formed because of pressure and shear stress as well. And having thicker skin there will actually not reduce your risk of getting blisters in that area. In fact, in most cases, the blisters are bigger and nastier and more complicated to manage. So people telling you to develop heaps of thick skin where you have had blisters in the past is not a good idea. You don't want to have raw skin there either, but definitely having the thick skin removed down to a sensible or reduced to a sensible level can be helpful at reducing pressure in that area. It's a really obvious one, but if someone's wearing shoes or socks, sometimes both that don't fit well, that can certainly increase your risk of developing blisters, particularly if you're participating in endurance events. So that's an absolute no-brainer to get that right. People often focus on their shoes and forget about their socks. So if your socks are a bit small, that is not going to help you. So make sure you check your socks as well. There are many preventative options for blisters. So taping is often recommended. If you're going to use tape, Fixamol Stretch, which is a hypoallergenic tape that is actually quite stretchy and flexible, is quite good, particularly for around the toes. Sometimes people use silicone toe caps or sleeves, moisture wicking socks, toe socks. People use 2 pairs of socks. There's these things called Engo blister patches, which are applied to the shoe insole or inside of the shoe, which are really good at reducing friction, and they're very low bulk, so they won't take up too much space in the shoe. So that's one that's worth considering. You can get insoles that help to reduce friction, and orthotics can be useful if there's something going on from a foot structure or function perspective that significantly increases the pressure on a particular region that's prone to blistering. The way to approach preventing blisters is to not try too many things at once and make sure that you actually try some things well before an event. A lot of the time we see people the week of Oxfam, Trail Walker or Melbourne Marathon or some other type of endurance event wanting to get advice on blister prevention. And it's really risky to actually implement something at that point in time. In most cases, they're probably better off just having a crack and seeing what happens. If you're getting some decent Ks in your training, that's a great opportunity to test out whether some of these options are actually helpful or not. And which one you go for is really dependent upon where the blisters tend to develop. So you do need to adopt a pretty specific approach. Really quickly, treatment-wise, generally for a blister, you want to use a non-stick dressing. If you have adhesive go over the blister, when you peel it off, you'll rip the roof off and it will actually be more uncomfortable and probably take longer to heal. People commonly use hydrocolloid dressings. Compede's an example. These are really only suitable though if the roof has come off. So if you put one of these on a blister that's got a roof on it, when you rip it off, it will rip the roof off the blister and you've gone a little bit backwards then, plus you have a higher risk of infection. If the blister has a tear in it or if the roof has come off, you should then consider using an antiseptic to reduce your risk of infection. And also that's when you would consider using something like Compede on it. You could talk all day about blisters, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea. Last but not least, really quickly, Tim asked about what causes black toenails and how you prevent them. If you get a black toenail, most of the time it's a bruise underneath the toenail. It's usually due to pressure from socks and shoes again, but foot structure can play a part, so particularly if someone's got clawing of their toes, that would put pressure on the ends of the toes. Often as well, people are moving around in their shoes too much, and that's a contributing factor. So you've got to make sure the shoes and socks fit well. You can look at offloading options. So particularly if someone had some type of toe deformity or something else going on that was putting the pressure in a particular part of that toenail. The lock lacing technique tends to hold people in a little bit better around the ankle area, and that can stop you sliding forward in the shoe. But there's a few options there, and if that's a persistent problem, you should go and see someone because there's usually a pretty simple fix for it. One thing to be mindful of is the black portion of the toenail should grow out gradually over time. It won't disappear suddenly. It will take a while, but it should always grow out. If you've got a black toenail that's not growing out and you can't remember any trauma that's occurred there, you should definitely get it checked out because it is an area where people can develop a melanoma. It's not super common, but it's also not uncommon. And often, if a melanoma is in a toenail, it's been there for a while because we don't check our feet all the time, and it does need to be looked at very, very quickly. So if you have a bruise there, you don't know why it's there, it's not growing out, and particularly if it was getting worse and growing back towards your toe rather than towards the end of your toe, then you should go and see someone ASAP. Awesome. I'll stop talking and let John get into it.
All right. Thanks, Shaun. I'm very mindful of the time, so I'm going to go through this very, very quickly because there's a lot of really good questions that have been asked. What I'll do is I'll read them out to the panel when I get through this little bit. But quickly, Jody, thanks for the question. Why is periodization in the training plan so important? Okay, number one, the goal of having periodization in your training plan, let's say it's a marathon plan and it goes for 20, 24 weeks. It is to maximize your gains while reducing your risk for injury and staleness over a long period of time. Simple as that. If you were to go linear from your current weekly kilometres, which might be 30, 40 Ks a week, straight to where you wanted to go to run a marathon of 80 to 90 Ks, good chances that you would overload, and that's already been discussed tonight. You'd get to a point where you wouldn't be able to train. You'd either become injured, fatigued, ill, and not continue with your training. So what we do is we put it into manageable increments. And if we looked at 24, I'll share if I can something with you guys. Probably won't be able to do it. All right, don't know if you can see that. Okay, so this is a basic marathon training plan, and it's fairly basic, but it's broken up into over 24 weeks, and 24 weeks is your macro cycle. Macro cycle could be 1 year, it can be 24, it can be whatever you want to make it. In that is mesocycles, so they could be a month, and microcycles, they could be a week. So you may have a week of super compensation where you do a really hard VO2 max 5K run or something like that towards the end as a trial. But you can see how if this was linear, and I'm hoping everyone can see this, you wouldn't just go straight up to that point where you got to 80. You sawtooth up. So you go up, you have a recovery. You go up, and each month you're going up a little bit more. And this is nice and neat because I like things nice and neat. It goes 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80. Now, for those that are sitting there saying, oh, that's not enough Ks to do a marathon, this was for a particular person, and it was their first marathon. So, and it was doable. So it had to be doable. So it's individualized, I suppose, is what I'm saying here. So the challenge when you have a periodization, challenge for the coach or putting it together would be how many hard sessions, what type of session, and when to do them. And that should all be worked out within these cycles. So it's really important that you mix easy with hard over a period of time so that you can adapt to the load over a period of time and not get injured. So that's the main reason for periodization. It's simply a process of dividing an annual training plan into a series of manageable phases, which is the mesocycles. So hopefully that answered your question. It's pioneered, look, it's used in all sports, a lot in weightlifting, it's all sports. Wherever you've got a goal, which you would fix, you work backwards over whether it's 20 weeks, 16 weeks, 12 weeks, depending on the distance, and you work out when your main sessions are going to be to hit your target, your goal. And that's what it's all about, getting there as fresh as possible and as fit as possible, which is really good. And it was pioneered in the running world by Arthur Lydiard many, many years ago. It's still used now. He used his system to train 800-metre runners and marathon runners, and he did it with great success using this now. A lot of coaches now use, and that system was called a linear system. Systems used now are more along the lines of mixed or funneled, where their athletes are already doing a fairly high volume and they're doing a mixture of sessions all the time. So they're only a short period of time from a big race. That's probably something that we do at Hawthorn Running Group, because I've got a whole lot of different people doing a whole lot of different things. We do a whole lot of smaller volume sessions, but we do different things over a period of time. But if one of you were to do a marathon, I would pull you aside and give you a program that was periodized and looks very similar to the one that I've got on the screen now, with the way it raises up. And depending on whether you're an 80K runner or I think you're a 100 or 120K runner, it'd be individualized to suit you. The mixed funnel type sessions used by coaches like Nick Beddoe, Bob Hudson, Schwartz. These are all very high level coaches, and they use it very successfully as well. But it's high risk, I think, for to use on an ongoing basis. I mean, you see a lot of athletes with Achilles problems and lower limb issues that train hard at a very higher rate for a long period of time. Anyway, I hope that answered your question. There was another one, I think. Stop sharing. If you want to put that one up, Chris. Chris is to do with, I think, sorry, Shaun. I think Chris asked the question, how fast should I be running my easy runs? Yeah, easy runs. You put easy run in someone's program, and all of a sudden it becomes an attempt at world records and PBs. And if I can run faster, I'll be a fitter person and therefore race faster. Complete opposite. Easy run pace. What I use is your best 5K time, current, not from 5 years ago, but current. So if you did a time trial, and let's just say you're in, just for argument's sake, so I can work the math out easy, 20 minutes, you've averaged 4-minute Ks. I would add 60 to 90 seconds to that, and that would be the basis for my long runs. The other rule of thumb I use, so it will become 5-minute Ks up to 5.5-minute Ks for my long run. Personally, what I prescribe would be, if you're running 15 Ks or less, it would be 5-minute Ks would be fine. If you're going above that, when you start getting up to your longer, beyond 90 minutes or beyond 18 Ks, you would start running at a slower pace. And I got that. I didn't make that up. I got that from Chris Wardlaw, who probably got it from a dozen other coaches. And it's just a simple rule of thumb to use. If you're working with heart rate, it's 55. Sorry, not heart rate. You can also use percentage. So it's 55 to 75% of your 5K, your best 5K time you're currently using it, running at the moment. And as I said, not what you ran 5 years ago or when you're in your youth. It's what you actually run today. So if you want to check that, do a time trial and work off that going forward. That's it, I think. I think I've covered that. If there's any other questions on that, they can pop up in the Q&A. But I'm happy now to throw it to the panel. You right, Shaun? Right to go?
Yeah, good to go, mate. I think we should probably work through these questions.
Yeah. Do you want me to read them to you? Or?
Yeah, maybe you go for it, mate.
Yeah. All right. So Rohit has asked a question. And this is probably for Chris and maybe also for Shaun. How to choose the best fit of shoe size, the size of shoes?
I'll start with that. Probably the biggest mistake that we see made in relation to the lack of appropriate appropriateness of shoes is bad sizing. I think it's probably overlooked a little bit too often. Everyone's always looking to maybe, if they're looking at shoes of maybe being a culprit, which is less than a lot of other things. But when they are looking at it, they're always thinking about support or structure, but we'd see a lot more issues from shoe sizing. So one thing to keep in mind is that you're putting a lot of force through the structures of your feet. There's a lot of bones in there, a lot of joints, and a lot of movement between those joints. So the rule of thumb that we work off is that depending on your foot size, that the difference between when you're just standing and then the size that your foot will get as you push peak force down into it is going to be about a half size for average size women's foot, and going up to a full size as you go up into, say, a size 12 men's foot. So you need to have enough or a compliant enough fit of your shoe that it's not going to interfere too much with the movement of your foot, and that you're going to have the space within the shoe for your foot to expand into as you load force into it as well. That's about it.
Okay. Yep.
Couldn't agree more. That's why I refer people to Chris and his team at the Running Company, because as Chris will acknowledge, shoes may not, or getting your shoes right may not prevent you from getting injured, but getting them wrong can easily see you get injured. And often you see a lot of people with foot pain that's clearly linked to their shoes not fitting right. And there's just so many other things that can go on that are harder to manage and control. Getting your shoe fit right is not that hard if you go and see someone that knows what they're doing. So, it's quite hard to do yourself. It's much easier to get someone that does it regularly to have a look for you. And I think it's also important to consider that your shoe size might change over time, particularly for women and women that have had kids. Often their shoe size will increase, but for most people it will change a little bit over their lifetime. So that's one other thing to consider. You might not be the same shoe size forever. So make sure you don't just keep buying the same shoe size without getting checked. Often people run into problems.
There's also a lot of discrepancy between the sizing of shoes from different brands and within the same brand as well. And it's not uncommon for the updated model of a shoe to fit either a little bit longer or a little bit shorter than what it has typically done. So a lot of people kind of get out going, they just buy the next version of the same shoe. The problem is that the scale of manufacturing is so large that the companies have to outsource all the manufacture. And there's a lot of variables that can lead to discrepancy in shoe sizing.
Okay. All right. Thanks, gentlemen. Question here from Vinny Martin. Hey, Vin, how you going? Should older runners, etc., in their 50s and 60s, I don't know if he's asking me to answer this, but look for different shoe characteristics as compared to younger runners?
Let me have a look at that. I would say in some cases no, in some cases yes. I think always the two key things, I guess, for anyone for a shoe is, does it feel good? And is it suitable for me? The does it feel good is going to stay the same no matter who you are, no matter whether you're a total beginner runner or you're out there doing 200 Ks a week and racing at a semi-professional or professional level. You want to enjoy it. You want something that feels good. One thing that we always kind of go by is that as you age, you're probably going to lose a little bit tolerance to stress. You probably don't want to do it. There's probably a little bit more margin for error with younger runners. So you want to be a little bit more conservative about things and maybe just pay a little bit more attention to what is going to be appropriate. We see a lot of people that have habitual, I guess, runners for many years where they've kind of always just used that same type of shoe. And it's always been fine, but suddenly, they start getting, maybe some issues as they're getting a little bit older. Pretty typical ones can be tight calves, tight Achilles, and it could be that they sometimes discount that footwear could be contributory because it's always been a consistent for them. There is the potential that the footwear has always just contributed a little bit more stress to their running, but they've just previously been strong enough to, or had a high enough tolerance to the stress to deal with that. So, you know, from as you say, in 50s to 60s, potentially just making sure nothing super flexible is probably going to be a little bit risky, making changes like that. So, you know, keep it feeling good, but just keep it pretty conservative as well.
Yep. Okay. Very good. Next question comes from Kelly Watts. Shaun, do you recommend putting a shim in a running shoe for a leg length difference, say of an inch or 25.4 millimeters for those that like metric?
No worries. Thanks, Kelly, for your question. Probably depends who you ask. I'm a little less interested in most limb length discrepancies. I think it's something that's overdiagnosed, and it's actually something that is very common amongst people just out there in the general population. A significant limb length discrepancy, particularly if it's something that's developed suddenly. So say someone has a car accident or a significant fracture and surgery or something like that, that's going to be something that would be more of interest, as the body won't have time to adapt to the changes associated with that. However, a lot of people do have a small limb length discrepancy that they've got around with without any issues for a long time. So I don't routinely treat limb length discrepancies. Sometimes I get people referred to me with a limb length discrepancy where it's been established what it is, and particularly if it's structural, then I would potentially look at doing that. But I'd also be looking to see if I feel like if that limb length discrepancy is contributing to them having symptoms in a particular area or not. As sometimes I see people have a limb length discrepancy treated and actually end up with more trouble and more problems than they had to begin with. So it does depend on the individual and their circumstances. So sorry, it's not a clear-cut answer.
Okay. Got another question here aimed at Shaun Christian. Should you completely stop running with heel pain, plantar fasciitis, and if so, for how long?
I'll have a go at that one. The short answer is probably not, unless you're in a really acute pain flare. So if it's a more chronic persistent condition, I don't find very much anecdotally that having a period of rest is all that good. And you see some people who end up in a cam boot for 6 weeks, for example, and they might come out and their heel may or may not feel better. And even if it does feel better, there's so much deconditioning that's occurred. And so what we've got to remember is our bodies are living things, and they require a certain amount of load to maintain health. And so that's load for our knees, for our plantar fascia, for our Achilles tendon, for everything. And if you completely unload it or stop running, then what actually happens is its capacity to tolerate loads comes lower. So Shaun discussed some of that with orthotics before. And the best way to increase load in your tissues is to do exercise. And what we use is a term called mechanotherapy. So there's no injection, there's no magic potion, no magic tablet can do anything that exercise can do. So the key is to reduce your running loads to a level where you're not getting significant pain flares. So what that means is if you go for a run today, tomorrow morning you want to get up, and it doesn't mean your pain's gone each morning, because we know that's when you often get heel pain first in the morning, but your pain should be normally what it is. So if 24 hours after you've been for a run, your pain's kind of what it is every other day, then you don't have too much to worry about, and you should continue running so you maintain some level of adaptation. And then the important thing about that is you need to then be really disciplined and have rest days and follow a structured training program of gradually getting back to running. There's a bunch of strategies you can then use to optimize how much running you can do without pain flares, so that you can achieve more without that flare up more than 24 hours later. And there are things like orthotics and taping and various other things that Shaun can help you with, things like footwear that Chris can help you with, but also doing things like a strength and conditioning program to get your calf and your foot muscles stronger, which will help take some load away from your heel. And then there's some simple, what we call gait retraining or running coaching. So essentially teaching you to run slightly differently, at least in the short term. And strategies like getting you to run up a bit taller are simple things you can try, and there's some ways in which we can work on trying to change running technique to take the pressure off. So the short answer is keep running, but the longer answer is consult with some people to make sure you can reduce the load in that area and be really sensible about your training load so you're not flaring up your condition. That's the longer answer.
And one more from Heather. She's a little bit angry, I think, here. Chris, is the discontinuation of your favourite running shoe and the constant upgrade of each brand's shoe just a marketing ploy to sell more shoes, or are they introducing legitimate improvements?
I would say that knowing a lot of people that make some of these changes, that the intention is good. There's the people that actually do the main design work for the shoes would probably rather tinker a little bit less sometimes. But there is definitely a marketing element and drive behind it. And I would say a requirement from potentially other parts of their businesses to continue to innovate and continue to have something new. It brings it front and center again to the consumer. There's very much always, from the people that work at the brands, though, a desire to continue to make shoes better. And some elements of the design will be driven by newer research or will be guided by what more current and relevant research will say as well. So, some brands can make some pretty big sweeping changes to some models of shoes. It's typically done with a drive for the greater good. The problem with running shoes is, though, they're so individual they could update a shoe, and for 80% of the users, it could be a fantastic upgrade. But for 20% of people, it might just make the shoe terrible. And so that's why we're always saying, like, you've got to just be individual with what works for you. And I'd say be flexible and be fluid with those shoes as well. Like, I mean, for myself, like I'd enjoy my running less running in kind of one shoe. And so I never really have too many of those problems about when they do change one of my shoes, it's on to the next thing. That said, there's definitely some real favorite shoes that I wish I would bring back.
Good. And finally, Andrew's asked a question of me. How long do you think a base period should generally be? Look, it depends, I suppose, on a couple of things. One, if you've been away from running, it should be a slow progression back to running. If it's a base period at the start of a marathon program, it could be anywhere between 4 and 9 weeks. First 4 weeks would just be general aerobic conditioning. The next 5 weeks would be slowly introducing some light fartleks, increasing the volume. Still with aerobic conditioning is the major part of that little mesocycle, if I can call that again. And then you just increase the speed work. Well, it's not actually speed work, it'll be threshold type work that you would add into that. So fartlek, strides, that type of work, a little bit of hill work. Hope that answers your question.
JB and all, there were a couple of other questions earlier in the piece which ended up being moved into the answered section, so I'll be really quick on them because I can probably take them. The first one was from Stephen about using foam roller for warm up and warm down. So I suspect he's probably concerned about tight muscles. And so I think if it, like the stretching side of things, if it makes you feel better and you're doing it, certainly it's probably not going to cause you any harm. And sometimes it can be therapeutic for specific things. But if that's your answer for getting a lot of muscle tightness or an injury, you're probably going down the wrong path. And what we need to always think about with why muscles feel tight is that happening just broadly because we're just training really hard, so we're going through that heavy training period, or is it happening with all of our runs? And if it's happening with all of our runs, there's probably a reason they're tightening up, and it might be to do with the way we're running. So looking at your running mechanics might be really important. and or a muscle will tighten because it's being loaded beyond what its capacity is. So often the answer to trying to solve some of these things is actually getting stronger. So if you're consistently getting tight hamstrings, I'll give you a little test because some people will complain about that. Test yourself out and see if you can do a bridge, lifting your bottom up with your feet up on a chair and see if you can hold that up on one leg. And I guarantee you most people who feel really tight calves can barely get off the ground when they attempt that exercise, and that's because their hamstrings are really weak. And so the answer to that is not stretching them all the time, it's actually doing some strength training to get them stronger. So that's a little test that you can do. And then had a question from Emily about using skipping or strength training for warm-up or something else. So I think light skipping can be really valuable as a warm-up exercise because it's dynamic stretching. I wouldn't do strength training as your warm-up because ultimately what you're doing is fatiguing your muscles. And equally, if you want to do strength training, I wouldn't go for a run and then try and do strength training. Try and separate those sessions out so you get the most out of each of them. The gap that's typically ideal for doing that is probably going for an 8-hour gap. So you might do strength training in the morning and do your run at night or vice versa. And that's probably okay, but I wouldn't use it for a warm-up. And equally, if you want to use skipping as a process of becoming more powerful or as plyometric training to improve your running performance, because it can certainly help with that, I wouldn't do that session as a warm-up for your running session because you'll fatigue yourself if you're actually running. But you can certainly use skipping as a really good cross-training mechanism. It's not going to put the same level of loads through your tissues as what, say, going out for a 10K run might be. And that's often something we use as a rehab, as a stepping stone, getting people back to more and more running. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Okay. Is that it with the questions?
Well done.
I think so. Look, on that note, I'd like to formally close the webinar for tonight. I thought, look, I've learned heaps listening to these three guys talk. They're absolute encyclopedias in their area of expertise. So I'm really happy with the knowledge that I'm going to walk away from this. And on behalf of everyone that was here tonight and the Hawthorn Running Group, I'd like to thank you for your time. Greatly appreciated. And I wish you all the best. Keep safe and to everyone, and stay at home. Thank you.
And just a special thanks to Shaun for organising it. It's happened without his effort. So thanks,
Well done,
Shaun.
Thank you all for tuning in.
And
No worries,
yeah,
guys.
of course.
Thanks for joining us. Appreciate it. Have a good night.
Good night.